Chapter 14. Several months had passed when talk of a secret memorial for the executed couple spread to all the farms. The night of the event kept changing, now that the weather had cooled and the possibility of high howling wind might offer enough cover. When the night was finally settled upon, it was very short notice, and yet we all had it in our minds to go. It was a Tuesday, a day when the patrols were typically a bit laxer and more cursory, and we had few worries about getting off the farm, as we knew how to get out of the locked cabin by then. Not to mention, the Lucys had become so nervous about sprees of murderous Negroes that come nightfall, they carefully locked their own cabin after bolting down ours. Late that evening, we pushed the table under the window hatch and hoisted Sarah through it. Once on the other side, she grabbed a stool from the loom and placed it down underneath the opening for those of us not so light on our feet. The walk was long, through a dark, tangled brush, and the strange map someone had drawn on a piece of cloth was blurry and hard to decipher. We bumbled around for a while, until we saw a lookout, a large man posted at the edge of a wide valley, who looked us over for a long moment before waving us in. "Watch your step," he said, pointing to a string of grapevine strung low between several tree trunks. We stepped over it and joined the procession of ashen faces, circling 2 leg-length mounds of dirt. Whitewashed crosses stuck up out of the earth. Several pots were turned upside down to trap the sound of a fading dirge. Every so often, we heard whistling, pairs of lookouts signaling to each other, confirming no danger was near. The song rose up again. People seemed to come and go, a throng thinning and thickening, and we were unsure if people were leaving or just trying to lessen the feeling. By then, we were fastened at the elbow, our arms linked, as if the song might unmoor us. A man was preaching in a low voice, and we all leaned forward to catch the prayer. We didn't notice Noah behind us until he slipped closer to Sarah. We allowed him entry into our line, where he slid in next to Sarah, his arm encircling her waist. Her body leaned into his, and he bent down and kissed her forehead. We let them be, fixating instead on the preacher's voice, the low, wheezy tone of it, as he spoke about redemption and the riches awaiting us in heaven. He barely spoke about the couple at all, and didn't assuage our worries about the ability of the 2 souls to get back home. A sharp whistle cut through the dirge, one short piercing blow, followed by 2 others. "Patrollers!" someone shouted. The lookout motioned for us all to run west, hopping over the grapevine and leading everyone away from the galloping horses and drunken men hurtling toward us. One by one, the patrollers hit the strong grapevine at top speed, the horses and riders thrown to the ground. The men yelped and groaned and cursed. We laughed and laughed as we ran, pealing bouts of laughter that slowed us down, but we didn't stop running, as we didn't know how long they'd be down for and how many might come after. In the commotion, the large throng split into smaller groups, scattering into different parts of the forest. We slowed down once we got close to Harlow's property line, and it was only then we realized Sarah wasn't trailing behind us. Sarah followed Noah to a large hulking oak tree with a hollow inside, large enough to hide in. They hurried down into it, crouching along the walls of it, on opposite sides of the opening. They could hardly see, and the longer they sat there waiting, their legs cramping underneath them, the harder it got to tell how long they'd have to remain there. The forest grew louder, the buzzing crickets and whippoorwills, the screeching owls and howling wolves. The longer they sat, Sarah felt as if she was stuck in some strange and timeless void, unable to see or speak, her feet asleep, tingling and heavy, as if they had grown roots and were now a part of the large tree. Inside her were both queasy cold fear and boiling rage. She could hear him breathing, and was surprised that even with all that was happening outside, she had the sudden urge to kick him hard, in the leg or the chest even. Marry a free woman, the gall. "I'm sorry," he whispered after a long while. "Shh. I didn't mean it." "Yeah, you did," she whispered back. An owl screeched nearby. She tried to shift her feet, moving the left one first, then the right, but they were both so numb she had to push at her ankles to get them to move. "Where you going to find these free women? Maybe they got free brothers." They both knew the law didn't work that way. The condition always followed the mother, but the words still stung the way she wanted them to. She heard him suck in her breath, heard him moving now, blocking the small opening where she could see a small crack of the outside world. She saw the jagged crack fill, then clear, and for a moment she didn't know if he was inside or out. "Noah?" No answer. He made a noise as he ducked back inside the tree and sat down near the opening. "It's probably safe now, but let's wait a bit longer. You hungry?" He unwrapped a bundle of cloth. "What is it?" "Corn cake." She ate a few pieces and then folded the cloth back over the rest. "Been thinking a lot about Mexico," he said. "We could go there." "Yeah? Where's that?" "Way south. I met a man from there when we was moving the cattle, and he sketched it out. He said to follow the river as far as you can, and then you keep going some days more after that. He said it's a long way, and the farther you go, there's hardly any water at all, but it's possible to cross." "Why would you take me? I ain't your wife," she said. She knew she was being silly, but the wound inside her was still itching and angry, and she just couldn't leave it be. He groaned. "What is it going to take for you to know that I'm serious? If you need me to get permission, to get Sutton to marry us, I'll do it. But why you need their word on things, I'll never know. Their word ain't worth a bucket of spit, far as I'm concerned." She knew he was right, and she tried to pin down what it was about the whole thing she wanted. It wasn't the sham ceremony with the cast-off dress and the bored white man raising his Bible in the air. Was it the witnesses she wanted? The cluster of friends and neighbors who would hold them to this public declaration? Or was it the step itself and what it signified? "I got it," he said. "Bind us together." "What? Don't play dumb. You've probably been working roots on me since we met." "I have not. Whatever you're feeling and doing is all your own self. Then bind us together now, husband and wife." "I can't do it now. I don't have the right things." "You sure that's it?" "See," he said. "It's you who's not serious." She moved closer to the opening and stuck her head out. "Let me look." She crawled out of the tree and stood up, feeling off-kilter and stiff-legged. She foraged together a makeshift kit, some damp earth, some long, reedy blades of bare grass, a splinter off the tree's bark facing the moonlight, and what little she saw of the molted skin of an insect. "Come out," she told him. I need the moon. And some of your hair. He crawled out and sat down opposite her, where she had laid out all the things she collected. He pulled a skinning knife out of his pocket and unwrapped it from a piece of cowhide. Slowly, he began cutting off a small chunk of curly hair from behind his right ear. She took the hair, rolled it between her fingers, making one long twist. From her own head, she untucked her plaits, fixed neatly at the base of her skull, and from the end of one braid, she pulled loose a few strands of hair until she got a few pieces that were long enough. Then she approximated a ritual, where she braided the bare grass and weaved in hair from both their heads. She had never done a task like it, had always been cautioned against it, in fact, but conjuring elders who warned of the consequences did so because often they were done without the consent of the other party. They were usually employed by jilted lovers, folks desperately seeking people who didn't want to be sought. That wasn't the case here, but she didn't know of any case like hers. And where normally she'd take that as a sign to stop and ask around, she felt as if the void of the tree had opened something, a space that might no longer be available to her in the days to come. With more hair from both of them, she made 3 braids in all, whispering a prayer as she worked, placing the corn cake down as an offering. You ready? She said. I am. Are you? She knew he didn't believe much in conjure, but like most folks had a healthy nervous respect for it, believing in its possibility to hurt him, but not to sway his mind to do things he didn't want to do. She tied one of the braids around his wrist. I take you, Noah, to be my husband, from this day on, until death parts us. So help me God, ancestors, and saints. The words felt strange in her mouth. The silly grin fell from his face. You do, he said. Yeah, she said with a shy smile. He leaned over and kissed her. Your turn now. He took the second braid and tied it around her wrist. I take you, Sarah, to be my wife from this day on, until death parts us. They kissed again. She then dug a small hole in the ground and dropped the last braid in. He helped her fill it back up with dirt. That all? She shrugged. I don't know. I never married anybody in the woods before. They both laughed. Come here then, wife, he said, leading her back inside the hollow tree, where they willed their bodies to merge until light broke in some hours later. As the sun rose higher, Sarah's happiness lasted only until she reached the farm's property line. She considered hiding out in the woods another day to try and blunt the wrath she knew was coming, but she wasn't sure if that would make it worse. She went around to the well first, drank until she was full, then crept to the fields, and though she wanted nothing more than to go to the cabin so she could wash herself and change clothes, she thought she might fare better if she went straight to work. Maybe Mr. Lucy had gotten a late start and hadn't noticed she wasn't out there. He was mercurial in his management of the day's work, sometimes stopping by at particular intervals, and other times just at the day's beginning or end. Only around harvest time did he remain out there the entire day. She made her way to the row without stopping by the main yard to grab a pickaxe or a hoe. Instead, she began weeding with her fingers one row over, as if she had been out there all morning. A few hours passed that way, the sun growing hotter as her stomach growled. She ambled over to Patience to ask if she had brought any food. Patience put a finger to her lips. Quiet. She ducked her head, peering backward over her shoulder. She then fished out a piece of cornbread wrapped in cloth and gave it to Sarah. Lucy knows, she mumbled, before drifting away. When it was time for our lunch break, we approached the yard as if it were quicksand. We grabbed some water from the bucket while we waited for Nan to emerge from the cookhouse with a tray of cornbread or ash cake. The door of the small building was closed, which gave us pause. No one could cook in there with the door closed. The hearth produced too much smoke. We shouldn't have been surprised when the door opened and the Lucys came out. He with a thick bundle of weeds in one hand and a snake whip in the other, and she with a tray of food. One by one they called us up and made us choose between our hunger or the whip, dividing us in 2 lines. He called every name but Sarah's, leaving her to wait and watch. Junie and Nan chose hunger and stood opposite Patience and Lulu, who both said they'd take the whip. The Lucys exchanged glances. Of glee or surprise, we couldn't tell. Harlow then raised the whip, cracking it high in the air. It's an ugly, stupid sound. He struck both Patience and Lulu each 10 times without stripping them down to the skin. Afterward, Patience was in so much pain she couldn't eat, while Lulu pushed through and ate so much she made herself sick. We weren't surprised that Sarah's punishment was a combination of the two. No food, surely, and like Patience and Lulu, 10 lashes while clothed. But we weren't dismissed yet. We were still there when they pulled Sarah from her knees and made her stand. Lizzie had to hold her up, while Harlow slid the iron harness over her head, the same one he used years ago. It rang and rang as they secured it in place. Won't be no more sneaking off now, Lizzie said. Now get on. The bean's aching to be cut, Harlow added, dispersing us back to the fields. The harness seemed heavier than before, the bell louder somehow than the last time. Sarah complained that it cut through every thought, made her teeth ache. We sent her to work on the opposite end, many rows over, where we hoped wind and distance would dull the sound. When we returned from the fields, we hung around the yard longer than usual, hoping Lucy would appear and remove it, but he didn't. In the cabin, we took up her sewing and made her sit or lie still so we could all have some peace. Sarah had brought in some mud to slather up there, but we warned her not to tamper with it, for fear Harlow would burst in if he didn't hear the clanging sound every now and again. Sarah, who couldn't find a comfortable way to lie down in the harness, tried to sleep sitting up, the upper part of her back propped against a pillow she wedged in between her and the cabin wall. She'd drift off, then shift in a way that sent the bell clanging, jolting her awake. She had stuffed a rag inside it and loosely fixed it with twine, so she could rip it down if Harlow appeared suddenly. The rag helped to blunt the sound, but even then she still couldn't sleep. Even with the medicine Nan had given her, the pain in her back and legs kept waking her up. She stared into the pitch dark of the cabin, where the only light depended on the brightness of the moon and its ability to leak through the holes in the roof. This night, there was no leakage, and she imagined herself back in the warm, cozy cocoon of the tree she and Noah hid in. She did her best to keep her mind there, like a pen fixing a hem it mustn't let fall. Any worries about whether he too had been punished or when they'd see each other again were best left elsewhere, somewhere far from the hollow tree and the wooded area that surrounded it. Chapter 15. Tired and slow, Nan moved through the woods in search of a welcoming tree. A nippy edge in the morning air pushed her to move a bit faster as she pulled her jacket tighter around her midsection. She swam through it with her walking stick, ducking spindly branches and tangled roots jutting out of the ground. She had been working almost non-stop for the last 2 days, guiding the arduous labor of Ada, a panicked housegirl on the Davidson farm. This was her 4th job this year, now that the Lucys realized that hiring her out to catch babies could bring in a handsome profit. Farmers paid the Lucys nearly $3 per successful birth, and she knew she was way cheaper and right more dependable than the young white male doctors entering the trade by the dozens. After a long delivery, Nan tended to the mother and baby. She boiled the soiled sheets and bedclothes, got some soup down into the mother, and the child successfully latched onto the woman's breast. She even smoked the clothing and bedding so the small room would be clear of ill spirits and energies during the child's most vulnerable hours. Technically, the smoking should be done in 2 days' time, but she knew it was unlikely she'd be able to make it back over so soon. And now, she was finally on to the last of her tasks, burying the afterbirth in the woods during the long walk home. She just needed a willing tree. Hardly any seemed pliant. She spoke to 2 elms and a cedar, and nothing. They didn't seem to want any part of it. She wasn't sure of their reasons exactly. The more tired she was, the harder it was to hear them. A wishy-washy oak seemed persuadable. She squatted down at the base of it and put down the 2 light sacks she was carrying. One contained her midwife tools, a soiled apron, pieces of cord, strips of cloth, scissors, small pouches of pestled sassafras, Jimson weed, and fever grass. And in the other smaller sack, a tangled ball of rags wrapped around the mother's placenta. Nan started to burn it hours ago, but Ada howled so and plucked it from the hearth with such speed it surprised Nan. The woman begged her to bury it proper, out in the Texas soil, in hopes that the child would be protected by whatever gods had dominion over this portion of the earth. Nan tried to dissuade her, but the woman wouldn't listen, clearly frightened that something dangerous was already after the child. Nan prayed with her, but she could tell Ada wasn't soothed by fervent appeals to Jesus, and the more she sat with the woman, she found she couldn't say no. After all, she was the first to hold the woman's son in her hands, the first to watch him draw breath, to stir him to crying and then soothe that cry, the first to wash the boy's tiny head and face and feel the sharp bird-like bones of his back. How could she spend the last 2 days preparing and making the way for his birth, only to deny him this one last thing? Plus, Nan didn't believe in ignoring the woman's fear. Even though she was a Christian, she hadn't let go of all the old ways either. She knew there were plenty of neighboring Christians who felt like she was straddling, that the Christian path allowed for no other sources of knowledge or help, but that never made sense to her. Why, there were all kinds of things Jesus was perfectly suited for, but there were others, practical, immediate things, where he was less so. It seemed foolish to deny oneself all the help that was possible. She poked at the dead grass with her walking stick. Underneath, it was hard as a rock. Without her small pick, she'd have to use the scissors. She pulled them out and plunged them into the ground, twisting and opening the blades in the dry, packed soil. It hadn't rained for weeks, and the dirt was hard and slow to give. She kept digging with the dull scissors until the hole got larger and deeper, but it was still barely deeper than her index finger. Exhausted, she leaned her back against the tree and let her eyes close for a minute. The minute multiplied and spun. A bird's urgent cry startled her. Her eyes snapped open, and the black lid of sleep slid away. The sky was darker now, the sun having shifted behind the clouds. Something rustled behind her. She turned to see a possum eating greedily, a couple feet away, its white pointy mouth stained with a pink wet substance, its furry black body lying among the tangle of rags and bits of bloody raw matter. "Get!" Nan yelled, backing away. The possum didn't move, only opened its mouth and bared a row of spiky teeth at her. "Get!" she yelled again, chucking a few rocks at the animal. The possum raised up on its hind legs and hissed. She lobbed her scissors at the creatures, hit, the possum screeched and darted off, leaving the tangled mess behind. A terrible feeling washed over her. What should she tell the new mother now? Ada would think the child doomed. When she had left her, the woman was already stringing together 2 sets of names for the boy, a shadow name she'd used to derail the evil already stalking her son, and the boy's true name, the name that would only be known by a select few. She warned the new mother not to name the babe so soon. It was bad luck to name a child before the 9th day. Before then, the child was merely visiting, the portal between this world and the one he came from still open. He could just as easily turn back toward it, but Ada ignored the warning, pleading instead for Nan to get the afterbirth buried quickly before the moon showed its face. Nan assured her she would and left. What else could she do? Maybe it was best to never mention the possum to the woman, Nan thought. She retrieved what matter was left and stuck it in the hole, but it wasn't much. A heavy feeling settled in her chest. That was the thing about baby catching. The responsibility didn't end once the baby came out, or once the mother was back on her feet. A baby catcher was always tethered to those she had delivered. She understood this earlier than most, when she was just an apprentice, helping out her own mother as a girl. Back then, she'd hoped to be a seamstress, not a midwife like her mother, or a healer like her grandmother. And it seemed strange that she had ended up so much like them, after all this time, when it had been nearly a lifetime since she'd seen either of them. As a girl, she declared she'd never be woken up at all hours by those sick with fever and boils, that she would never make her own children sit bedside over ailing patients, fanning away fever till morning. She'd never have people showing up at her door, day and night, telling her to drop whatever task she was in the midst of, and come here, get in this wagon, or walk these many miles because so-and-so's fixing to have her baby soon. Not that sewing and laundering for white folks was trouble-free, but it seemed a heap better than cleaning up the deluge of vomit and excrement that flowed so freely from the sick and ailing. But that was ages ago, back in Maryland, when tobacco was still king, and she thought the rest of her life would be spent at the nexus of the Chesapeake. She'd see the watermen fishing, the black men who worked the huge nets for the canneries, catching shad and herring. One even taught her how to read the water, how the colors were a code of sorts, how they could tell its depth and what fish may lie underneath by the hue of the water, be it brown, green, or blue. She was sure she'd marry a waterman one day and have all the fish she and her mother wanted. And she'd learn how to sail, too, how to steer and navigate the tiny boats down the winding rivers with ease. But cotton intervened. The big, churning maw of industry geared up and sucked her and millions of others farther south, toward the Carolinas and Georgia and Alabama, and farther still. And by the time she reached Texas, still then part of Mexico, in an outpost colony riddled with yellow fever and delusion, she convinced herself that her earlier selfishness in regard to the sick was partly to blame. The sun was shifting again, hotter now. She covered up the hole and retrieved her belongings, trying to think of some way to mitigate what had gone wrong with the afterbirth. It would plague her, she knew. The path grew denser with brush and moss, and she moved slower, watching her steps. In the yellow grass, the scaly green head of a box turtle stretched toward her. That might do just fine, she thought. She set her walking stick down on top of the turtle shell and pulled out her scissors. She reached down and grabbed hold of it, the tiny head and legs retracting inside the shell. "Not gonna hurt you, fella." With the blade of the scissors, she scraped 3 symbols into the shell, 2 crosses and a cosmogram, a request for protection for the new babe. She turned to the west, holding the turtle so it faced the direction where the sun would set, and she let it go. It remained still, in its shell. She went on farther, and when she looked back, the turtle was gone. With the dirt so hard and the river dry, she wondered if the turtle would get very far, but it seemed her best hope for reaching the boy's ancestors. It would be up to them to do what the tree couldn't. Once she returned to the cookhouse, she fell asleep in the back room without removing her shoes or repacking her sack. But after a few decent hours of sleep, she found the boy's fate still haunted her. She wasn't sure why. She had delivered many babes that grew up to live horrible, stunted lives, no matter how much spirit work she did. And there was little way of knowing if those efforts might be in vain, or if they had actually shepherded a soul through a gauntlet of tribulation. It was the reason she got in the habit of keeping a few souls back, returning them to the other world so they could choose again. A different time and place, a different mother in better circumstances. It seemed a way to balance the scales a bit. But she worried now that maybe she hadn't managed to balance anything at all. Evil was always hungry, and maybe more so now. And that perhaps she had only succeeded in starving it, making it so ravenous and torrential in the lives of a few, instead of sporadic and peripheral in the lives of many. Maybe now, it couldn't spread out. All it could do was devour whole the few souls still coming. Before the week was over, she'd add more animals to the boy's protective army, another turtle to carry messages to the boy's dead people, and by Christmas, 2 dead chickens. She didn't kill the chickens herself, but instead gave 6 sweet potatoes to Mariah, a new root worker located on the other side of the creek, to wring their necks and bury them at opposite ends of the new mother's yard, where they would stand sentinel in the spirit world over both the babe and his mother. Chapter 16. Even with the harness removed, Sarah was fading. Her skin paled to a strange gray. And by the time we were all standing around in the hot sun, watching her marry, she was nearly invisible. Or maybe it was just the heat making everything waver that made it seem as if she was disappearing. If the sun was paying us any mind from up there, we must have looked a gay affair, all crowded together and dressed as if for Sunday service. We were all there, and the neighbor folk too, stiff and carefully arranged. At the fore of the crowd were the Lucys, Mr. Lucy waving a sweaty Bible in the air, and Mrs. Lucy off to the side, fanning herself in a light blue dress. Sarah and Peyton stood closest to them, both stock still, their faces damp with sweat, pale, swishy fabric hanging from their shoulders. Sarah's dress was a dingy yellow, Patience's a faded gray, both refashioned from Mrs. Lizzie's old nightgowns. Mr. Lucy cracked open the Bible and began reading from a turned-down page. "The good book tells us 2 are better than 1, for if they fall, the one will lift up his fellow. But woe to him that is alone when he falleth." Sarah stared at something low on the ground, a dark, seeping oil stain in the dirt. Her arms were folded across her stomach, her fingers fidgeting with what looked like a soiled piece of twine tied around her wrist. "If 2 lie together, then they have heat. But how can 1 be warm alone?" said Mr. Lucy, closing the Bible with a dramatic flourish. "Amen," said Lizzie enthusiastically. It was hard to tell if Sarah was listening at all to the white man officiating the ceremony or the man standing next to her, nodding and murmuring along in agreement. "We are gathered here today," Mr. Lucy went on, "to join Sarah and Monroe, Patience and Isaac, in holy matrimony." The 2 men, Monroe and Isaac, came some months ago, shortly after the New Year. They arrived half-starved and ashen, bought cheap off a planter fleeing the malaria of Houston's river bottoms. The first few days, the 2 men were dizzy and lightheaded, barely mumbling a word, while they readily attacked trays of corn cake and drained buckets of water without measure. Of the 2, one was older and broad-shouldered, with a thick beard. The other was lanky, bare-faced, and full-cheeked, like a giant child. We learned later the older one was called Monroe, the other Isaac. But we didn't care to learn their names. We only wanted to know what purpose they were brought to serve. Were they breeding niggers like Zeke, or were they just men who would pull the plow, fell trees, and load the drays so we no longer had to? We avoided them best we could, took to eating our meals earlier, and since Mr. Lucy soon employed them in one building project or another, we got our way for a while. They slept in the barn, and we retained the cabin, and for once, didn't mind being locked up together inside it. They built a storehouse and an additional room onto the Lucy's house, and the couple took this as a sure sign that their luck was turning around. A stretch of good weather followed, leading to a good early showing, where we produced the most bales we ever had in a single harvest. 24 bales, almost double what we made most years. After that, the 2 men were set against each other in a grand race to build 2 cabins identical to ours, one on either side of the one where we lived, and it was then that we had to consider them, look at them, hear them, smell them, They thought us rude and haughty, spoke about us in a dialect we couldn't decipher, and we debated among ourselves whether it was better to be recipients of their love or their hate. We paid little attention to the race itself or the chest thumping it brought out between the two, how they enjoyed riling themselves up and putting on a show, and though we were sure this was for our amusement, we didn't give them the satisfaction of laughing. Softening toward them seemed dangerous, and we still hadn't figured out all the contours of this particular danger. We pretended not to notice their different approaches to the competition, while Monroe concerned himself with speed and the progress of his competitor, pushing himself to get a shoddy shell of the structure up in a day. Isaac moved at his own pace, only seeming to care about the soundness of the logs he chose, the rightness of the pegs, the alignment of his corners. So it was little surprise that Monroe finished first. The night he finished, Mr. Lucy showed up at our dinner full of praise, the two men following behind him. He broke out a barrel of cider and gave everyone a round, and with a toothy grin, revealed what the reward was. "I told you I had women, didn't I? Now, Monroe, for your reward, you get first pick for a wife." Monroe gave a sheepish look at first, then pointed at Sarah. Mr. Lucy clapped him on the back and laughed, the kind of low-chest laugh often shared between men. "Good choice, and I expect many portly children, you hear?" Monroe nodded at him, then at Sarah. She turned her face away, shutting her eyes tight. "Isaac, your turn," Harlow said. Isaac shook his head. "Got a wife I like back home, sir. Don't have need for another." Mr. Lucy laughed and clapped Monroe on the back again. "Tell him he can choose, or I'll choose for him," he said, his voice light and without edge. He turned to Isaac. "Or would some hickory oil make all this go down easier?" Hickory oil, another euphemism for a whipping of some kind. Isaac took a long look at him and at us, while we each prayed to be unseen, invisible, ugly. And when Isaac didn't answer, Mr. Lucy clapped him on the back too. He handed him another cup of cider. "Don't ruin a good time, I say." Harlow squinted at us, closing his left eye. We all looked elsewhere, avoiding the roving eye and where it might settle once it landed. "Patience. Yep, she's the one, all right," he said finally. "Now that that's all settled, Monroe, you and your wife will live in the cabin you built. And Isaac, you and Patience will live in the one you built. Isn't that a treat?" We had all stopped eating by now, the food sour in our mouths. Patience's eyes darkened, a sudden redness around the rim, her fists balled up at her sides. Sarah, on the other hand, was surprisingly calm, as if she had heard nothing. The only thing that gave her away was a slight twitching in her face she kept trying to hide with her hand. The next day, Sarah and Monroe moved into one cabin, Patience and Isaac in the other. That first night, when the sun descended and dark filled the sky and the door of the cabin closed shut, Sarah felt as if she had been locked in a small, airless tomb. Monroe was there, fiddling with a stubby candle that wouldn't stay lit. "Why mice love to eat these things, I'll never know," he chuckled. "You not afraid of the dark, is you?" Sarah felt the panic inside her grow louder. All day it had been a low-grade hum, but now it was an incessant clanging, like the bell of the harness. "Try pine knot," she said, her voice shaky. He shook his head. "It's getting late, and I rest better in the dark." She could only see the shape of him now, on the opposite side of the room. She was sitting at a small table he had made, carding, even though she couldn't see much. She laid the thick tuft of flax over the metal teeth and pulled until the crackly sound of it grew louder. She heard him lie down on the bed, strung up on the left side of the cabin, the cable holding the mattress creaking in response. For a moment, she felt her own tired body, her aching back and clenched shoulders, and wanted nothing more than to lie down too. But there was only one bed in the room, a singular bed they were expected to share. She pushed her work aside and laid her head down on the rickety table and closed her eyes. Within minutes, his loud snoring filled the room. Sarah awoke with a jolt and stood up. Carefully, she pulled the front door open and slipped outside. She scoured the area for the Lucys, or any trap they might have set. Earlier, Harlow had made a big production out of not having enough supplies to lock down all 3 cabins, as he had already had the men's leg irons made into other tools. And she worried his whole performance was a ruse to see if she would try and sneak off the farm to see Noah. She hadn't seen him since the night of the funeral. She had heard from the neighboring folk that he had been laid low with the cat-o'-nine tails for some weeks, and afterward was sent up to Sutton's ranch to work the cows, but where that was, she didn't know. She crept outside and pushed open the door into the middle cabin, where only Junie and Lulu lived now. Junie stirred and raised her head. When she saw it was Sarah, she shifted over on the edge of her pallet. "Don't let them find you here in the morning." Sarah closed the door and lay down next to Junie. She pulled the covers up to her chin, even though it wasn't particularly cold. She stared at the sky, through the holes in the roof. A distant star winked at her. She gazed back at it, but could no longer find joy in it, or the lazy stars around it. Instead, the star was a speck of some kind, a strange, indifferent witness to Noah and their union. And it seemed cruel, somehow, to be left with a witness so useless as this one. In the weeks that followed, Sarah never got a full night's sleep. She moved from the fields to the loom to the new cabin in a daze. Her hands a moving blur, a glazed fatigue in her eyes. At dusk, she made food for both her and Monroe, grinding enough corn for their dinner, before making ash cakes or corn pone, along with a strip of herring. Whereas the women had always taken a communal approach to dinner, rotating who cooked each night so the rest of the group could get started on that evening's sewing, the presence of the men in the quarters quickly terminated this agreement. When the men first arrived, they stayed in the barn, only steps away from the cookhouse, so Nan was responsible for feeding them. Now that they were in the quarters, that duty fell to the women. And as Lulu and Junie immediately refused to cook for someone else's rusty husband, the task soon fell to the wives alone. Sarah made Monroe a plate and sat down to eat quickly before picking up her sewing for the night. He talked to River while they ate, no matter what happened that day, and she'd nod and make the expected affirmative sounds as required, all the while waiting for him to pass out on the bed and leave her be. Most of the time, his chatter was filled with the same talk. He'd tell her stories about home, about Virginia and tobacco, about working rice in Georgia, about his first wife and firstborn. These stories would run into one another, the links between them porous as rain. She only half listened, unsure if he was talking to her or himself, and only later did she realize that there were things he wanted her to know. He didn't have the women to trade with the way she did, to give things to hold when they got too heavy. But the truth was, she didn't want his things, not his memories or the rough-hewn objects he had begun making her, and she was too young to know that was the worst kind of rejection there was. Her aim was to keep only the hands visible, as if the constant cooking, washing, darning, and sweeping would keep the man from climbing on top of her one night. She tried, though. She made herself a pallet to sleep on the floor in one corner of the room, where her few belongings lay, some changes of clothes, a lock of hair from her mother, a small cluster of blue beads. Among these belongings, she hid a small treasure of pointed rocks, even carrying one in her apron pocket as she moved about the day. She fed her saints daily and drew lines of protection around the pallet, powdery lines of salt and grave dirt that kept Monroe constantly complaining about the floors and her inability to keep them clean. Sometimes she'd return from grinding corn and see him sweeping the lines away, fussing all the while. "Where this white stuff coming from? Am I dying? You dying?" She just shrugged and waited until he fell asleep, before putting down a fresh line, fainter than the one the day before. In the morning, she'd wake up before him, not long before the cow horn blew, and if he stirred during the night, she awoke then also. This is the bargain she made with the exhausted parts of herself, now always threatening mutiny, always threatening unconsciousness at the slightest stillness. The only bit of relief seemed to be in the effect that lack of sleep had on her mind. It raised time somehow, made it so only the smallest square of the present seemed accessible to her. Everything else, be it missing Noah or the other women, felt as if it was lost, somewhere trapped behind a heavy, impermeable curtain. After a while, Sarah could no longer live on such little sleep. Her fitful naps transformed into heavy, dense slumbers she found hard to wake from. It was then, one Wednesday night, when Monroe crept beside her, positioning himself on the edge of her pallet. He pressed himself against her, and she wasn't sure how long he had been there, when she woke up in alarm, thrashing and slapping. Her hand hit his back with a loud crack that echoed throughout the room. "Stop it," he said, grabbing her arms, but she continued to flail, now thinking of her pointed rocks, trying to grab a hold of one. "Quit it, and I'll let you go." She paused her thrashing, and he shifted over a bit, releasing one arm while still holding the other lightly. But he was still too close to her, his breath on her neck, his bare thigh touching hers. "I've been patient, haven't I? Even let you work your little roots until you got comfortable. But my High John the Conqueror ain't never failed me," he said, chuckling softly. It had occurred to her that he might be working roots of his own against her, but when she last swept out the cabin, taking extra care to poke around his few belongings, she hadn't come across anything that appeared to be a charm or a mojo bag. She kept still as she could, still searching for a pointed rock with her free hand, but there wasn't anything there, just dirt and dust. "I found your little rocks, if that's what you're looking for," he said slowly. She took in a sharp breath. The room was dark, and she still wasn't used to it, still felt disoriented in the new cabin, the way the chimney was on the opposite wall, the sparse furniture, taller and arranged at odd angles. She wondered how fast she could get to the poker leaning near the firebox. There were sticks there, too, kindling and such. "I'm a good man, can be a good husband to you, if you let me. I can be real sweet to you. Now, we've been getting along real good, and I say it's about time we start acting like husband and wife." He kept his hand on her arm, his thumb now grazing the frayed bracelet on her wrist. Sarah snatched her arm away and in one deft motion slid aside, placing her back against the wall and drawing her knees up to her chest. "But we not married. Lucy just put us together like he does the cows," she said. Her mind spun back to the conversation the women had been having the first few days after the two men arrived, if it was better to inspire their hate or their love. In the close walls of the dark room, she instantly knew the latter was her best chance. "You know a gal needs some things," she continued, "before she can take a man on as her husband. You can't just mount her like a horse and expect her to care for you. You ain't never caught me proper, or do none of the things I was told a good man does before you can call him your husband. And just 'cause you say you're a good man don't make it true. I need to see for myself. Give me some time to know for myself." He didn't say anything for a long while. She worried then that he could see the futility of her plea, that there wasn't anything he could ever do that would turn her heart toward him, or make her regard his presence with anything more favorable than benign indifference. She would never choose him, because she never had a choice in the matter, and the choice was the thing. "All right, missy, I'll give you that. Long as you stop with the roots and things. We gots to meet in the middle, don't we?" he said with another low chuckle. "We do, yes," she said, though she had no intention of stopping any of her efforts. Already she was trying to figure out what she could use that might overpower his High John, while she waited for him to get up and move back to the bed on the opposite side of the room. But he didn't move. He just lay there, his limbs now spread out over the pallet, a loud snore erupting from his throat. Nan had long suspected Monroe's tolerance with Sarah would soon wear thin, so she wasn't surprised when Sarah came to the cookhouse asking about poisonous herbs. At the time, Nan had her hands full with Carol, so she told Sarah she would think on it, but hadn't given the request another thought until she saw Monroe slinking around the Lucy's house a week or so later. She had just stepped outside with a sack of the Lucy's dirty laundry when she saw him and Lizzie talking a few feet from the house. Monroe stopped talking when he saw her, but Lizzie, her back to Nan, waved him on, shifting Carol from one hip to the other. "Spit it out. What exactly is the problem?" "She's still cold, mean, never kind to me, no matter what I do for her," he said, lowering his voice. "Mm-hmm," Lizzie said. "And?" "Ma'am, I'm not a savage. I'm not the sort to thrash a woman for it. I've been nice, understanding." You want me to whip her? No, that'll just make it worse. She'll probably stop speaking to me then. What do you care whether she's hot or cold at all? Long as she does as she's told. Carol started to cry, and Lizzie turned back toward the house. Seeing Nan, she pushed the baby toward her. Nan dropped the sack and came forward, taking the child in her arms. Ma'am, Monroe said, not having moved from his spot. Lizzie turned and glared at him. She say, Monroe began tentatively, we not real husband and wife. Maybe because we never got married proper, like with a Bible and a meeting of some kind. Does she now? Lizzie said. Nan pinched Carol's leg, causing the child to cry louder. All right, I'll see to it, Lizzie said, waving him away. She turned back to Carol. What now, little girl? Later, Nan worried she caused the conversation to end too early, but she wanted to distract Lizzie before she committed to any real action. Carol kept the woman's mind full, easily diverted from one moment to the next. It seemed likely that if Carol's wailing kept up for the next several hours, the whole conversation might easily slip from Lizzie's mind. Chapter 17. To honor and obey until death or distance do you part, Mr. Lucy said loudly, slapping the Bible for emphasis. There was an uproar of clapping and cheering. Mrs. Lucy laughed and twirled. The crowd surrounding the couple stirred to life and rushed forward to greet them. Only the couples themselves seemed out of time. Isaac whispered something to Patience, and she released her grip on the sides of her dress. Unlike Monroe and Sarah, the two were of the same mind about the whole thing. They both had spouses elsewhere and were content to live as siblings under the same roof for now. They'd have to deal with the Lucys and their expectations at some point, but until that time came, they'd manage. Monroe took a hard look at Sarah, searching her face to see if this whole affair had changed anything inside her. Would she hug him, touch his arm, or even meet his gaze with a warm smile? He waited a long moment for some signal from her before reaching out to draw her near. But within seconds, she was already gone, moving through the throng of people to a tall young man standing in the back. The man wore a low hat and an ill-fitting jacket, but he could see the man's eyes were fixated on Sarah, and when she reached him, she collapsed against him and buried her face in his chest. The man wrapped his arms around her, whispered something in her ear, and only loosened his grip when he looked up and saw Monroe's eyes narrowing in on him. The two men exchanged looks, a whole conversation of some kind, each accusing the other of being the true interloper. Monroe started toward them, unsure of what he'd say when he got there. So, this was the reason, was it? All this time, her rejection felt impersonal, more like a skittish deer trying to settle its nerves. But now, seeing the young man, it felt different, more pointed, more offensive. Though in some ways, the act of winning her over wasn't personal to him either. He wasn't even sure he liked her. She wasn't kind like his first wife, or a good cook like his second. When she washed his clothes, she left yellow clay streaks that dried and caked in the sun. Not to mention that smelly herb she insisted on wearing, saying it helped with her sinuses. But he had never heard her complain of sinus trouble, never seen her with so much as a runny nose. If he wanted her at all, it was only because she was there. Because he liked the softness of women, how they made the most horrible things feel better. How even when they cussed you, it sounded sweet. And it didn't seem like too much to ask in this God-forsaken place to look at one person and have them look back at him with something like kindness in their eyes, even if it was temporary. That she had already had someone made sense, and seemed like something that shouldn't rub him wrong, but it did. Maybe because she never said as much, or he had never noticed it on her. Or maybe just seeing them together in that way reminded him of home and what he'd lost. Hating whatever separated him from his family made him feel stupid and impotent at the size of it all. But hating them, this young man in a stupid hat, he was easy to hate, as was she, easy to make the reason for all that was going wrong now. Harlow stepped in Monroe's path, put a hand on his shoulder, and grinned a mischievous grin. This was a mighty expensive affair, but I don't mind, because I know you're good for it. Monroe nodded. Let's drink to all the children you'll have, Harlow said, leading Monroe to a spread of food and drink that rivaled any Christmas feast he had ever known. Harlow poured him a shot of whiskey and signaled for the fiddle player to start up. To a blessed and fruitful union, he said to Monroe, clinking his cup. Now where's Isaac? Harlow looked around at all the people, milling about, eating and drinking. Why the missus had to invite all these swell bellies, I'll never know. Harlow then looked at him and laughed. Drink up, he said. I know you'll do me proud, won't you? Monroe drained the cup, the liquid burning a line of fire down his throat and into his stomach. Woo, that's good, ain't it, boy? You want more? Monroe nodded, his eyes roving the throng for another glimpse of the two lovers. Without seeing them, he imagined them clearly, in the throes of another embrace, rubbing against each other as lovers are wont to do, and laughing at him, at his cast-off faded jacket a size too small, his tattered trousers, his gifts of whittled spoons and furniture, and he had a sudden urge to pummel them both. People ate while Sarah and Noah lingered about in opposite directions. She stood at the end of a long table, nibbling a bit of sweet potato, while he hung around the fiddler, and it wasn't long before they both vanished from the party, meeting at the creek the way they had all those times before. A strange and heady feeling washed over her, being in his arms now. He was talking fast, a stream of chatter to dislodge the disorientation of being so close to one another after so many months apart. We tried it your way, but we got to do something else now, he said. But the patrols are worse than when Manigat got knocked over. It's the only way. A firefly swam past Sarah, moving toward the flat gray water. What about Sutton? He's got money to burn. No, Mexico is the only way. Something about the finality of his words made them both quiet for a long while. Sarah stared at the lowering sun. I should talk to him. Today, said Noah, speaking about Monroe. You know, make it clear. Don't do that. You start peacocking and it'll be worse. Worse how? Just worse. Fine, bird. What then? She tightened her arms around him. Still got that knife? It flashed across her mind, the curved, skinning blade he carried with him that last night in the woods. Noah's eyes widened. Not on me, but I can get it. You think it'll come to that? She wasn't sure. If Monroe had a truly ugly side, He hadn't shown it to her yet. What did Nan tell her he said to Lizzie that day? That he wasn't a savage sort? But could she trust that? Should she trust that? She could see now the worry in Noah's face. She shook her head. Maybe she was assuming the worst. No, I can reason with him. Noah didn't look convinced, but she didn't bother trying to convince him further. She kissed his face. Come on, we should head back. I'm sure someone's looking for us by now. Noah groaned. They rose to their feet and headed back to the farm, only letting go of each other once they reached the flat area of the yard, where the party was still in full swing. Can I have some? Lulu asked Monroe, pointing at the cup of liquid in his hands. He gave her a curious look and handed it to her. She sat down next to him and brought the tin to her lips. She took a long sip, but didn't relinquish the cup. She felt him looking at her, but pretended she wasn't aware, instead looking at the crowd of people eating and drinking. Someone she couldn't see was playing a fiddle, and people were dancing to it. A couple of women had moved into the center and were now doing the buzzard lope. She had never learned how. You not gonna give it back? He said. No, she said, flashing a wide grin at him. It's mine now. A look of confusion fell over his face. He opened his mouth to speak and immediately closed it. She wasn't sure what spurred her on. His confusion, the strong, heady liquor traveling down her chest, or the sway of the two women dancing. So why you pick her anyway? Lulu said, turning to him. Huh? Sarah, I say, what made you pick her? She said, smiling up at him again. I don't know, he said, the tension in his arms growing slack. What do you care? I don't. Was just curious is all. You don't have other things to be curious about? Oh, tons, she said, giving him a lingering glance. He was softening now. She could feel it. She's young. Figured she'd be easy to deal with, that's all. Lulu laughed. Oh, you figured she'd mind you, do whatever you say. He gave her a sheepish grin. Well, it's not too late to change, she said, resting a hand on his arm. It's not? He asked. What Lucy care for? Where the babies come from don't make him no never mind, long as they comin'. I suppose it don't, he said, staring at her curiously. And you'd like that? Me telling Harlow that I want you instead? She stared at him for a long moment, not saying anything. His words came easy, just as she thought they might, but when they washed her over, she felt nothing. Sure, there was a slight rush of triumph, but not the warm feeling she'd hoped for. She closed her eyes for a second, searching around, but no, it wasn't there. All she could feel was his anxious, sticky gloom. Lulu, that what you want? He said. She shook her head, drained the cup, and handed it back to him. No, I was just saying. His face changed, his mouth now open in surprise. Oh, look, there's the lovely bride now. I should go give her my well wishes, Lulu said, nodding her head in the direction of the property line, where two figures were standing. From here, it was hard to see them clearly, but that yellow flimsy dress was a dead giveaway. It puffed up with air like a balloon. Sarah was wrestling with it, walking toward the party, with Noah trailing behind her. Lulu turned to see Monroe's face change again, from surprise to anger. She stood up and moved away from him, slipping back among the revelers, and was there in the middle by a table of dessert, in time to offer Sarah a slice of gooseberry pie. The girl took the plate, and Lulu looked back to see Monroe watching the two of them, a red pall over him. The sight of him alone and angry confirmed why the warmth wasn't there. It's strange she didn't recognize it before. How alone he was. No one wanted him. Not Sarah, not any of the women, or neighbors even. Maybe the former wives he sometimes spoke about, but it's likely they were just more pliable than Sarah. Women stuck with him who were better at hiding their disdain. Any interest in him, ignited by that initial pang of jealousy she felt when he first chose Sarah, was completely gone. She had cured it. The horrible event over, Sarah hovered at the edge of the yard. She had already helped the others clear and wash all the dishes, things Nan said could wait until tomorrow. She took up also. She swept the debris in the yard in slow, weightless strokes as she sensed a storm brewing in Monroe's small cabin. She thought about the land, what was on the other sides of the surrounding farms. How far could she walk, in one direction or another? Could she outrun the dogs, the gangs of white men with guns? Should she trade the certainty of one angry man for the possibility of half a dozen? She looked for something else to do, something to delay the moment when she'd step into the mouth of the cabin, where she knew he was likely waiting. There hadn't been more than 2 words between them since the ceremony, but she knew he was angry. She had kept her distance from him most of the day, and yet he seemed always about, a fixed eye glaring at her. It was frustrating. She, who had become very good at going unnoticed, at being softly invisible, could no longer be so. Maybe it was the stupid dress, the flouncy, flimsy nature of it, the way it caught light and swam in the wind, or just that her desire to be invisible was so strong it gave off a smell. The kind that couldn't help catching people's attention. The kind so naked and raw, it drew some near, or turned others away in disgust. And since she had little idea what was waiting for her inside those 4 walls, it seemed the best option was not to return to them. She wished she was more prepared, that she had put together a trick bag by now, with some illness in it, to lay him low, some legion of tiny reptiles to take up residence in his leg. That, or some way to pry the high John from his grip, but she still hadn't learned where he kept it. The moon was hidden by the clouds, which made it even darker. A pocket so black she could barely see her hand, now that they had extinguished the torches and lanterns placed around the yard. One by one they went out, like a sequence of notes, a low bass falling to the bottom. She thought about Noah, how he felt like a dream evaporating. How long could she lace hope around it? How long could she let the hope of it make her reckless in thought and deed? She picked up a stick and carried it low, scraping a trail in the dirt. A circle, a pointed arrow, a series of linked curlicues. She was pointing souls now, a whole army of them to nest inside the 4 walls, and she hoped by the time she got there, a war would be happening between her saints and his. She crossed herself and spun, left and right, as if she was trying to reach some hinge in the air, unlatching some hidden thing where all the otherworldly help could pour out of. She was so tired, of the day itself, and all that happened and what awaited her next. Tired of the whole mess of it, this strange life that seemed stuck in one place, on one note, like a fiddle with only one string. She was tired of the man's dumb anger, how solid it was, like a large, deep rock, and how he kept shoving that rock toward her, as if it was hers to climb. She pushed open the door of the cabin, one piece of dark opening into another. He wasn't snoring like usual, the only sound the scratching of mice in the corners. She waited for teeth to seize her throat, like a panther or a bear swooping in with lightning speed, and when a wooden post slammed into the back of her head, sending a throbbing blackness over her entire body, she felt a surge of relief, as she waited to see God's face and hear Gabriel's horn. He took her on the floor then, with blood in her eye. He took it less because it was the wedding prize he felt owed him, but more because the presence of the other man dared him to do so. He wanted her to know what happened when he wasn't kind or patient, and more so, what happened when one didn't respect the grace they were being offered, when one spat on it plainly, turned their back on it clean. Now that he had literally put the fear of God in her, he would have no need to be ugly again unless she made him, he told her. It was up to her, he said. She could live in heaven, or she could live in hell. It was her choice. We begged Sarah then to come and stay with us. Lock-ins were few now, but that night had changed her. Noah kept sending her messages, and each time she refused them, telling his little boy messengers not to come back. They kept on coming, one with a handwritten letter she had to get Junie to read to her. Bird, if you don't love me no more, tell me and I won't bother you again. From then on, Sarah and Monroe's cabin became a battlefield, each trying to best the other, wound the other, conjure the other. She left mojo bags under the steps, laced his food with sedatives. He'd wake up half blind and zombified. She set aflame his High John the Conqueror and any other protective work she didn't recognize. Afraid to even touch it, she swept it all into the fire, along with his clothes and shoes. She started working on his senses then, hearing, taste, and sight. His tongue numb, his foot lame, each changing with the weather, rotating with the sun. We dragged her out some nights, but she'd go back, shutting the door on us. And as darkness settled over the yard, a bell went off inside them both. Some nights neither would start up. They'd stay in their protective corners, watching each other. Other days, it was bound up in the air, and there'd be no stopping it. He'd throw a plate at her, and she'd charge him with a poker, stabbing him in the arm with its sharp end. We didn't know she was that spry, that wily, and it seemed a surprise to herself that she could wound and hurt this mountain of a man. And then there was no ending it until she drew blood. She was collecting it then, his skin, his blood, his hair, his semen, and she kept pushing to get it, her pain tolerance growing higher, dulled by sharp blows of her own. This fighting of theirs grew into something we couldn't understand. The way they scratched, slapped, and kicked each other, sometimes wrestling on the floor until they both were bruised and sore. How somehow it seemed some dark and twisted catharsis, this bloodletting of rage they unleashed on one another. And how sometimes at the end of it, tired and smarting, she'd mount him, the weight of her hand heavy across his nose or throat, until he was gasping for air. If any sex happened between them, she controlled it, brought order to it, refused to be surprised by it ever again. And slowly, he grew thinner and more sickly, so sick, he lay up in their cabin, wheezing like a man twice his age. It was then that he begged her for forgiveness, that if she healed him, he'd do right, he'd do whatever she wanted. And we're not sure we ever saw her happier than she was then, when she had Monroe's whole life in her slim brown hand. Sarah kept Noah's letter under her clothes at all times, tied around her torso with a piece of thread. Sometimes it scratched and crackled as she moved about. When she was alone, she'd take it out and trace the funny slanted characters with her index finger. She had memorized it by now, had made Junie read it so many times the paper was soft and stained with grease. And though she worried it might slip out one day, that someone might find it, she couldn't bring herself to get rid of it. The truth was, she couldn't say whether she still loved him. The parts of her that loved him, that lay with him beneath moon and sky, were somewhere else now, inaccessible and unknowable. What she remembered felt like something on the underside of the sea, a glimmering country somewhere far off, much like that freedom place neighboring kin whispered about, someplace unmapped and ephemeral, its coordinates unknown. What she had now, in place of her love, was rage. It woke her up in the morning and kept the hoe alive in her hand. Part of her wanted to kill Monroe, and the other part wanted him to live a long, wretched life, one where she could wreak all kinds of hurt and havoc, as long as she wanted. Monroe's illness brought a reprieve. Sickness made him quiet, made him fearful, and thus calm. The Lucys couldn't diagnose what failed him, and fearing contagion, they sent Sarah back to the cabin of women. She nodded dutifully, covering a grin with her hand. Among us, she said little. She was mercurial, at turns joyful and distraught, but still primarily silent. When we asked her what trick she had used to lay down Monroe, what pestilence she had loosened inside his body, she only shook her head and gave a sly, closed-mouthed smile. Nan doused the man with calomel and castor oil, but didn't press Sarah to tell her anything more. If there was a frolic or a candy stew, she declined going, but wouldn't share with us what she'd rather do instead, and we'd return to find her gone, only to hear her slipping inside the cabin hours later, filthy and wet. And so we shouldn't have been surprised to discover that she had taken up with Noah again, though gone was the girlish giddiness of before, the flowery talk and the silly sweet grin so hard to contain, we'd tease her by holding her chin. Maybe she was reassembling herself somehow, putting herself back in a moment before Monroe and Isaac ever came.